town administration's boundaries also intersect with the SEZ. So the closest town is Alibag, but the SEZ itself is referred through the name of one particular village, the Ranjankhar SEZ. The first time I went to Alibag to meet with some of the folks who are organizing around the Ranjankhar SEZ was in June 2009. It was during the monsoon, so that's all I remember, because I left from Bombay. It's past New Bombay. It is the next district, and so it's part of Raigad. And so I took a taxi, and it took me around 3.5 or 4 hours to get to Alibag. And then we went around, and a lot of the local activists kept talking to me about how this space is nothing is going to ever happen here, right? I mean, and they were not talking about it in terms of the resistance movement that was going on, that was preventing the acquisition of land, etc. The SEZ had been declared in end of 2005. I went there in 2009. Only 16% of the land for the SEZ had been acquired. The government had made various interventions, and in spite of the interventions, the land acquisition wasn't going forward in any serious way. The company in charge of the SEZ was a company called India Bulls, which was positioning itself as an infrastructure company. But any investigation into India Bulls will show you that it is primarily a stock trading company and a real estate company, and that's what all that was. But it was India Bulls Infrastructure that was in charge of this particular SEZ. And everybody in town, everybody whom I was meeting, right, kept telling me nothing is ever going to happen. And they were not meaning it in terms of we will prevent everything from happening here, but they were talking about it in terms of even if we fail and the land is acquired, nothing will happen. Right? So I kept trying to ask what that means, and what finally emerged was that many of them felt that this was just merely a real estate play, more than anything else. And at that moment, I couldn't quite understand why it was a real estate play. 3.5 hours from Bombay wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world to think about, especially through Panvel and in that area of Navi Mumbai, which is a complete disaster zone in any case. Right? But the next time I went to, and everybody kept telling me, "Agar aap ferry leke aate to aaram se," right? And I didn't quite believe it, in the sense that I thought, ferries. I'd lived in Bombay for a bit, never really felt the presence of a ferry system in the daily life of Bombay, right? And so I wasn't very convinced. The next time I came in the winter, and I decided to take the ferry. In 35 minutes, I was in Alibag, from Colaba, from Gateway. Right? That's when the whole real estate game kind of became absolutely apparent and visible to me. Right? So the one way of thinking about it, and this I found as a pattern again and again, especially around large metro clusters, right? If you think about all the metros, right? The proliferation of specific kinds of SEZs around those metros, right? In significant part, many of those enclosures that were created were part of a particular real estate regime that was a bubble that was building, and continues to be that kind of a development. Right? Many of them are headed in the direction of setting up SEZs, setting up some industries which might even be produced to fail, which might even be set up to fail. Right? The other kind of SEZ space, of course, is let's say, and even just to come back to the other, and in some places this real estate game is absolutely visible. So, for instance, in the SEZ, Chajjar SEZ outside Delhi, right, had long sessions with the local peasants who currently own the land. And it was very clear from my interaction with them that they were just waiting for the right price. Right? They were just waiting it out, and they built a very militant movement against the, it was a Reliance SEZ, and they had built a very militant movement, including their leader was a kind of was an army captain who had taken early retirement and come back and He'd been leading a very militant movement in terms of at least the rhetoric, and including things like acquisition of some arms and fighting at the police, and things like that were happening in Jaja. But any conversation with them, it was pretty clear that they were just waiting for the right price, right? So I don't want to make it, every resistance that exists, one need not necessarily think that it's all, once it's a real estate game, there could be all sorts of logics playing itself out. The other end is where it seems like some production and productive activity is actually the reason for the creation of the special economic zone, right? And there I think POSCO would be an excellent example. POSCO, the MOU was signed in 2005, in June 2005, and quite immediately after that, within 6 months of that, it was declared an SEZ. And the POSCO project is a project of a South Korean steel giant, Pohang Steel Company, and it's a 12 billion US dollars, USD 12 billion project. It's the single largest foreign direct investment India has received during the neoliberal period. And so it's kind of a darling of the bureaucracy and the state forces, in the sense that it's become one of the most symbolic projects in that sense. Right? Nobody wants that project to go away, because when it was announced, it was under with such hype that it was almost a story of India's final arrival on the neoliberal stage, when it can bring one of the top 5 steel manufacturers and strike this brilliant deal, etc., etc. Right? And it's a 12 million metric ton steel plant with a captive mine around 140 kilometers from the location of the steel mill itself. Steel plant itself. The steel plant is in the Jagatsinghpur district of Orissa, affecting and there's a captive port, a private port, that's going to be built along with the steel plant, which are both in Jagatsinghpur district in 3 gram panchayats, 9 villages being totally the villages that will be completely displaced and affected by the project. 22,000 people who will be displaced, and if we take the fishing communities, etc., that depend on the Jatadhar River, that is where the port, the mouth of the port is. Rather, the port is at the mouth of the Jatadhar, leading into the bay. If you take that entire fishing community, then the total number of people whose livelihood will be affected will be in excess of 50,000, beyond the 22,000 peasants who will be displaced, right? So I'll come back and characterize these communities a little bit more, but then...
can you just tell me a little bit about where the mines are? And
yeah, so that's what I'm doing, that's what I'm doing. Sure. So this is the coastal district of Jagatsinghpur. The plant and the port is in the coastal district of Jagatsinghpur, slightly north of along the Orissa coastline, and just around less than 130 kilometers from Cuttack, and maybe 150 from Bhubaneswar, right? And so the plant and the port are there, and the one easy way for many of us to recognize where this is that this beautiful private port that they want to build only for the purpose of POSCO using it is 9 kilometers south of Paradip port. That is, there's a fully active, huge port that is there in place just 9 kilometers away, but they want a private port there, right? So we'll come to why that is necessary. And POSCO has gone on record several times saying that it's not interested in the project if the port is not available to it, right? So the port and the mines are really, really important for it. POSCO has also gone on record to say that unless the mines are cleared, it's not interested in the project, right? So there's something about the port and the mines that I want to come back to. Now, 140 to 160 kilometers away, in the districts of Sundargarh and Keonjhar is the mines. That's the Kandadar Hills. The hills range across 2 districts, and that's where the mines are, right? And that's where I started my story of 40 kilometers of trucks. And that's a whole mining area. It's got a history of mining. It's not a new mining area, but there's something that we need to think through, and I myself am unclear about it, about the rate of extraction, right? When I say it's an old mining area, right? There are lots of mining enterprises that have been there in that space, even from 40 or 50 years ago. But the rate at which the extractive industries have gone in and have changed the landscape of the Kandadar Hills itself in the last 10 years is quite dramatic, right? And that's what people like Dushkar Bari were trying to point out when they point out, when they point out to what happens if you leave at 10:30 in the night, or when you go out and buy a bottle of water and it gets coated red in no time, right? None of those were experienced. I mean, according to, for instance, one of the quotes that I carried back with me from Dushkar was, he says, the Kionjar and Sundargarh, the mining area, is the place where you have the maximum number of self-evictions, right? That is, the mines happen. The mines are not in, your village has not been uprooted by the mines, but the living conditions become so horrifying that you have no choice but to move. You cannot sit for a few minutes without, for instance, you cannot bring a plate of food and try and sit and eat it because of the dust that will settle on it, and it will become inedible. Right? So that's the situation. So he says that what needs to be recorded about those two districts at this point is the rate of self-eviction that's happening. Right? And in political organizing terms, there's not much political organizing that's happening. The Maoist movement has just in the last year or year and a half begun to make a presence in that area, right? But that's as recent as that. Now, so in June 2005, the MOU was signed, and within 20 days after the MOU was signed, the villagers in these 3 Gram Panchayats, the 22,000 affected by the steel plant and port, began a process of organizing. And very soon after that, the POSCO Pratirod Sangram Samiti was created. And after a process of around 6 months of all sorts, it is a very locally generated movement, and that's some of the interesting stories I can share with you maybe in the Q&A period if necessary. I mean, they went through an interesting process. The local population, as they started organizing, went through an interesting process of vetting the leadership that they wanted to figure out. They kind of very early on made a decision that the leader, that there has to be a leadership somewhat from outside, that it can't be completely local leadership because they felt they didn't have the capacity to transact across multiple spaces by themselves. And so they looked to other political organizations.
Can I just ask a point of clarification? Sure. The mines, you said they were already there was extraction going on. So
not by POSCO.
No, but so now it's POSCO that's taken over. So they've been
not
sold.
Yet, not yet.
Yeah.
So no, it's new areas being opened up. In the region, in the Kandahar region, the new areas being opened up. Today, as of right now, the exact coordinates for the POSCO mines are not known.
I see.
In the sense that, okay, just to diverge and quickly complete that stretch of the story, the moment the POSCO mines were announced by the state...
POSCO mines meaning POSCO has been sold those mines?
No, they would be given a lease for a certain set of... It won't be sold, it will be a lease.
Sure.
And all that they had been given was something called a prospecting license, which is for a very limited area.
Just to see what
and once you know the prospecting area, you know the lay of where the mines are going to be, though you don't know the exact coordinates of the mines.
Sure.
Right? Kudremukh, Iron and Steel, which is a public sector firm, went to court saying, wait a minute, these mines have been allocated to us. Right? So that was but that went to court, that went to the Orissa High Court, and then the case just vanished. In the sense that Kudremukh withdrew it, nobody knows the history of that. Right? Most probably the state put pressure, but the central government put pressure on it, Kudremukh went. But thankfully or otherwise, another mining company, and the name of the company is escaping my mind right now, also filed a petition saying that it was also on the list of applicants for the same mining space. And so it went back into court, and right now is in Supreme Court. So there's a certain kind of silence about the POSCO mines right now. And the silence is because everybody keeps calling it sub judice and nobody wants to touch it. And when we did our report and we tried to estimate what populations were going to be affected, etc., we did it by looking through some of the public court records and pulling out as much details as possible, and then going to Kionjar and Sundargarh and trying to ask them, so this is what we know, which are the villages that might be affected. Right? So even